Welcome everyone to the Protecting Montana from Data Center Impacts Forum. Really good to see people here. This is a nonpartisan forum. It's a panel discussion sponsored by Montana Environmental Information Center, Upper Missouri Waterkeeper, and the Helena Interfaith Climate Advocates. My name's Hank Hudson, and I'll be serving as the facilitator and the MC tonight. Our panelists will be Ann Hedges from the Montana Environmental Information Center, Guy Alsentzer from the Upper Missouri Waterkeeper, and Ashley Fischer from Waking Giant. So we've got some great panelists tonight. To get things started tonight, to introduce this topic, I wanted to say just a few words about this issue. Wow, data centers have risen to the top of people's attention. They've risen in national attention. You can't go anywhere without hearing discussions about data centers. It's energizing the public, and it's no wonder, it's no surprise. Data centers are a pocketbook issue. They have to do with utility costs, values of land, the use of land. They're an environmental issue, addressing perhaps additional carbon released into our atmosphere, how land is used, most importantly, how water is used. Water is very scarce. They're a big issue. It's a big issue, but there's really one issue that maybe even overrides those issues. That issue is, what right do citizens have to participate in decisions? Decisions that impact their lives. What responsibility does government have to be open and honest and stand between monopolies and their captive customers? Those questions are as important as the questions about air and water. We need information, not protective orders and secrecy. We're being asked to make a quick decision and not ask too many questions, and I think that's a recipe for disaster.
Amen.
So tonight, we're going to take the opportunity to learn and to ask questions and start doing this process the way it should have been done. So, without saying any more, I want to turn it over to Ann Hedges.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here tonight. I know it's a lot to ask people to come out midweek, so we appreciate it. This is an issue that's kind of taken the whole country by storm. MEIC has had similar events to this in other communities across the state. They've been incredibly well attended, lots of people very, very interested. And it's taught me that this is not a partisan issue. The questions that people need to be asking have nothing to do with party politics. They have to do with our air, land, and water. And these are questions that absolutely need to be answered before we should allow any data centers to locate in this state on the scale of the data center hype that's going on right now. So, first question, really simple question. What is a data center? A data center is just a big warehouse full of computers. There have been data centers as long as there have been computers. This is not something new. What is new is the type of data center we're seeing. We used to worry about, MEIC at least, used to worry about data centers that were cryptocurrency operations. We still do worry about them, but we thought that that was a problem. It is, but we're not going to talk much about that tonight because the NVIDIA chip has changed everything. These are chips that are super fast at processing. They are able to do things that we've never been able to do before. These large language models that these companies are investing in use an enormous amount of power. These chips use an enormous amount of power, and they get really hot. They also need a lot of water to cool the systems, to keep them at a temperature where they can still process information. So while we've had data centers forever, we've never had data centers like this. These are operating at a completely different scale than what we've seen in the past. And so a data center is a big warehouse full of really fast computers. And it needs cooling, and there's a number of ways they can get cooling for their systems. They need a lot of electricity. There's a lot of ways they can get electricity. And they can have an impact on communities. And we think that all of those issues should be resolved before data centers start coming into Montana on especially the scale that they are interested in doing. So next slide. This really came to the attention, the national attention, about a year ago when a Harvard professor released a study, and it was called Extracting Profits from the Public, How Utility Ratepayers Are Paying for Big Tech's Power. This report was an excellent primer on data center impacts across the country, what communities are experiencing, how much utility rates are rising. We saw this, we decided to go to the legislature last year because of this report and simply proposed a bill, and Tom Schneider was one of our proponents of that bill, among a few other people, bipartisan, asking data centers to report their annual energy use to the Public Service Commission so they could better plan our energy system. That bill never even got out of committee. It was the most milquetoast ask you could possibly imagine. I would never go back to the legislature with such a milquetoast piece of legislation ever again, now that I know what I know. But this is what happened. And then last summer, you had PJM area, which is an East Coast region of the United States. They manage the electric system, and they found that that their watchdog calculated, they're like their consumer council, that 70% or $9.3 billion of increased electricity costs over the past year were caused by data centers. That's in one area of the United States. Next slide. So this really got on our radar, but it's been on the radar of a number of people for quite some time. You're going to hear some of that sprinkled throughout what I have to say. But the bottom line is they are energy monsters. They need an enormous amount of electricity to power their systems. So this is from the Department of Energy a few years ago, where they show you, these are basically data center growth rates, right? And then they projected in 2024, this is the low end of what they thought data centers would need across the country. That was the high. In 2028, this is what we're looking at right now, is that high scenario. That scenario, these guys are building as fast as they can. They're spending every dollar. Big tech is spending all of its dollars on data centers. It is a race. It is a race to the finish line, trying to figure out who's going to make the most money off of AI. This was the projection. It turns out it unfortunately may come true. And we need to be really careful of that, because that kind of energy need means that we're going to have to build more power plants, more transmission lines, more distribution lines. They're going to use a ton of water. You're going to hear about that from Guy. Those numbers are really, really big in a really short amount of time. We don't have the ability to meet that demand. So the question is, where are they going to go, and who is going to suffer the consequences of their going fast and breaking things? And this is just an article from last year saying energy demand from data centers is growing faster than the West can supply. That's just a fact. That is absolutely a fact. Next slide. So let's set a baseline here, if we could, and just talk about Northwestern Energy, the biggest utility in the state of Montana, and what's been happening already with their rates. So as this graph shows, this is energy demand in Montana for residential customers. It's been really flat for a very long time. So it's not that residential customers have grown their energy demand tremendously. It's been really quite flat. But yet in that same amount of time, you're seeing that we've seen, since re-regulation basically, to today, you're seeing an 87% increase in the rates for electric utility users of Northwestern system. 87% in just not quite 20 years, despite our demand being flat. That's the current state of affairs without data centers. Next slide. This is one that we just put together for the rate cases, and it shows just since 2022, Northwestern Energy's rates have increased 39.4%. If you thought your electricity rates had risen a lot lately, they have. You are right. It is not that you're using more energy. It is that the rates that are approved by the Public Service Commission at the request of the utility have gone up by almost 40%. Next slide. So that's a struggle for a lot of people in Montana. Meeting those their energy costs is a challenge, and it just got more challenging because the PSC just approved a new rate increase. But what happens when Northwestern Energy's announced data centers actually come about? So this is how much energy Northwestern's existing customers use. They need about 760 average megawatts of power to serve current demand from residential, small business, its existing customers. This is what's happening now. This light pink are all the proposed data centers that Northwestern has already told, they've issued press releases on, they've told the Public Service Commission. That's how much energy they would need for all those data centers. And then we just learned this month in one of their investor calls, so they're not telling the Utility Commission what they're telling investors. And they told their investors that there's 11 more in the works. Now that's split between Montana and South Dakota, but they don't tell us how many are in Montana, how many are in South Dakota, where are you going to get the energy, where are these things going to be located. So if we actually had all of that in Montana, we'd go from needing 760 average megawatts to needing over 4,000. I mean, where is that going to come from? Where are we going to build all this generation to service these? And who is going to pay? Next slide. So Karen Kirk, who lives in Bozeman, she works for Yale Climate Connections, and she did an analysis on rates nationwide. And this is not specific to Montana. This is rates generally. And what you can see is that until about 2007, there's three different really customer classes that utilities serve. There's your residential and small business, there's your commercial, and then there's your big industrials. And so you can see until about 2007, 2008, all of those were pretty much, they moved together in tandem, or I guess in unison. And so they rose together. But then you see something change, and you see that they really start to split out, where your industrials, they flatten out, but residential customer rates nationwide have been increasing. And then you see something really dramatic happen in 2021, and you see that residential rates have gone through the roof. This is all over the country. And commercial, and which includes data centers, have not risen as fast. And industrials have risen even less. So who's paying the price for all of this, what's going on in the world? It's falling on the shoulders of residential customers because we're not adequately represented at the Public Service Commission. We're not adequately represented in these utility commissions. Utilities go to these utility commissions in every state, and they bring in a zillion lawyers and all sorts of experts, and we are outgunned. And so what happens? Utility commissions make decisions based upon the record. They have to. That is their obligation. They can't go outside of a record that is created for them to make a decision. And the best information they have in the record comes from the utility. So they are raising rates for us because the utility commissions are believing that residential customers are the problem. But what we're seeing is now data centers are actually really driving up a lot of the costs. Next slide. So this is, most people a year ago hadn't heard of data centers in any way that really mattered. And suddenly it's a big deal. And so it is this race to the finish line. It is the tech industry going fast and breaking things. And the question is, how long is this going to last? Are they all racing to a finish line and that's going to evaporate? And are the needs that they are projecting going to evaporate? And this is just a slide to show you that this is risky business. That this is not a given that all these data centers that they are projecting will ever come to pass. What we need to be really careful of is that if we start building things for data centers and then the data center disappears, the company behind it, like Meta did in Louisiana, this happens. They get they get all sorts of perks, and then they back away. And they're no longer responsible for the infrastructure that gets built, for the generation that gets built, the community impacts that occur. And these, if these guys aren't real, if this is just a bubble, we want to make sure that we are not caught up in it. We want to make sure that these companies that are coming to Northwestern are separated from the rest of us. So we are not, as residential customers, the ones who are going to have to pick up the tab for all of this infrastructure and generation that we don't need, but data centers do. We shouldn't be paying the bills. So as you can see, the Wall Street Journal saying the frothiest AI bubble is in energy stocks. This one just came out this week from Motley Fool. Bank of America survey. AI bubble just became the biggest worry for credit investors. That's this week, that's just a couple days ago. This is the news, this is what's going on in the investing world. There's a lot of investors who are very, very worried about this. And it turns out, anyone know that Taiwan produces 90% of the fast chips in the world? 90%. If China does something to cut off that supply, our tech industry is in really big trouble. Our economy is in big trouble. And we are tying it all to something where everything is manufactured overseas. So read that New York Times story that just came out this weekend if you're interested in that story. But this whole thing in China, they hurried up and they built a whole lot of these data centers, and a lot of them are now sitting empty. It was a bubble in China. If this is a bubble here, we really need to make sure we're protecting ourselves, because the consequences could be significant for residential customers. Next slide. So the challenges with data centers, property tax, air permits, e-waste. So these computers turn over every 3 to 6 years. They have who has a 10-year-old computer in their house? Tell me how it works. These guys aren't using 10-year-old computers. They are switching out their systems every few years. That leads to an enormous amount of e-waste. It's got to go into a landfill. It's got to be recycled. Something's got to happen to it. We don't know what that is. We know that the lifespan is short. Are these guys going to really change out their computers? Are they going to say this isn't worth it? We're not going to do it, and we're stuck with this big infrastructure that nobody actually wants? That is a risk. Jobs issue. You know, the only argument I've heard really in favor of AI, other than I like some of the benefits of AI, who doesn't? And I think that there's some good applications of AI. This is not an anti-AI. I am not anti-AI. I am anti-AI in certain sectors of our economy, surveillance and things like that. But what I'm saying is we have to be careful of the consequences of AI, because what it brings with it is a lot of challenges for us. But it does bring jobs. It brings a lot of construction jobs. But those jobs are usually traveling jobs. They're people that go from state to state building these facilities. They're specialists. They're like specialists in, as electricians, as plumbers, and building. So it's not like these are permanent jobs. There are very few permanent jobs associated with data centers once they get built. And I did a presentation in Broadview, Montana about a month ago, in which one of the panelists works in AI. He deals with data centers every day. His life is dependent on data centers. He's never stepped into one before because he doesn't have to. He doesn't have to live at the data center. He relies on it for his job. But these data centers don't necessarily bring local jobs. They may bring jobs, but these are folks that can live anywhere. They don't have to live in our communities. Next slide. And data centers are bipartisan. I started out by saying that, but it's absolutely true. You're seeing more and more Republicans raise concerns about data centers. So Ron DeSantis and Bernie Sanders are in agreement on something. Go figure. But Ron DeSantis, he is worried about the growth of data centers in Florida. I wish our governor were, but our governor is a data center governor. That's the arena he comes out of. He absolutely is doing everything he can to pursue data centers coming into Montana. Next slide. So what has the legislature done about this? And thank you to all those legislators who are here tonight. I really appreciate your service. But the legislature as a body has been abysmal on this issue. So in 2017, before anybody was paying attention, they got a property tax rate for data centers of 0.9%, lower than homeowners. Lower than your residential property tax rates, one of the lowest property tax rates in the state. It wasn't until 2025 that the legislature actually made residential homeowners' property tax rate a little bit lower than data centers. But also in 2025, they extended that property tax rate to everything connected to data centers. So their broadband, all of the infrastructure for the communication systems, all of their energy, power plants, transmission lines, distribution lines, everything that's peripherally related to a data center also gets a 0.9% property tax rate. So that's the legislature's great idea. Other proposals that would just report your energy use, a study resolution. Let's look at this issue. they defeated those. They said no. They don't want to learn more. They don't want to know more. They don't want more information about electricity use. They just want to give them a low tax rate. Next slide. So that's the legislature's response so far. So the question is, who is in charge? If it's not the legislature, the governor has an energy task force, aka the data center task force, that's trying to figure out how we can build more power plants for data centers. I mean, that's his energy task force. That is what they are really focused on. They also are talking about transmission, which I agree with. That's a good idea. But the rest of it, it's loaded with data center representatives. It is a data center task force trying to figure out how we can get more of that. So the governor, he's not useful. We have the legislature. We've seen, and I really mean that. We've seen the legislature not do its job. I've heard a lot of legislators recently, though, say they want to do something next session. We have a package of bills that we're thinking about for next session. Then you have the Public Service Commission. And the Public Service Commission to date has asked some right questions. It's taken them a year, and they still don't have the answers from Northwestern Energy. But we actually petitioned a whole slew of organizations throughout the state, petitioned the PSC back in December to set up the rules, not December, November, to set up the rules for data centers. Come on, we need some rules for how they take energy to make sure that existing customers are insulated from the impact these things can have on the grid system. And the Public Service Commission still hasn't acted. They asked Northwestern to answer the questions that we posed. That's it. That's their big hurrah. The Public Service Commission 100% has authority to regulate these activities and to protect us as existing customers. The big question mark is whether they will actually exercise their authority. Northwestern is banking that they won't. And then there's your city government. And you're going to hear about a whole lot of the local impacts that occur with data centers. There are a lot of local impacts, and I think those are going to have to be resolved through your local government, probably your county commission. I know that some people just went to Yellowstone County Commission yesterday and asked them to get busy with some interim zoning because they're worried about a data center outside of Billings. But the question is, who's in charge right now? It appears nobody is in charge. Next slide. This is our approach. Next slide. This is what Northwestern has provided to the Public Service Commission. That is what we know about data center agreements between Northwestern Energy and the data centers. It's all redacted except for a couple lines that say this is confidential. This is unacceptable. We are challenging this. We are not okay with this being our level of information, especially when they tell investors more than they are telling the PSC and the public in this state. That is really not okay. You know, the public shouldn't have to listen to Northwestern's investor calls to find out what's actually going on, but they're very insightful. Northwestern is bragging about all the data centers it's going to bring into this state. This is what they tell us. Next slide. So I'll answer this. If somebody has a question about nuclear, should we go nuclear, I'll come back to this, but let's leave it for now. Next slide. And then the communities, let's go to the next slide. I've already talked a little bit about e-waste. That's just the foundation for energy issues related to data centers. There are so many things we can do, things that we have to do. We need to put pieces in place before these guys come here. We need a regulatory framework to make sure that we are protected from paying the bills of the richest men in America. They can afford to pay their own electricity bills, and we should make sure that they do. So next is going to be Guy.
Good evening. I said good evening. There we go, we're awake. That squeak didn't get you a couple minutes ago, I'll get you going. My name is Guy Alsentzer. I work for Upper Missouri Waterkeeper, and I feel like sometimes I'm at a AAA meeting, you got to say, you know, what am I here? Well, I'm an attorney. So they said, we're going to talk about regulatory impacts, and the unique perspective I get to tell you is we're not prepared for what data centers present. We don't have a framework for addressing what data centers present. And if there's one theme that I want you to take away from what I offer tonight, it's that if our legislature can pass tax breaks for data centers, why can't they pass rules that protect your drinking water, your ability to have clean streams and our ability to have vibrant outdoors heritage and great wildlife. I think they can. Remember that. Why tax breaks but not protections for your water? All right. So when I think about water resource impacts in data centers, this is what I'm thinking about. The fancy term consumptive use, a non-fancy term pollution, and then I think about, well, what is that framework? What are the tools on our tool belt to be able to either protect ourselves or conversely to clean something up? Next slide. All right, how do data centers use water? So I'm gonna start with the basic funnel technique, right? We're gonna talk broad about what are we working with here, just like Ann did, and then we'll get into some of the nitty gritty about what you can or should be doing in pretty much every single local government body we can think of. So first thing, we're gonna have direct impacts, right? This is how they actually use the water, and I think the biggest thing you can take away is there's a big sound by these data centers. They need water to cool it down. If you've ever ridden a motorcycle, it's got liquid, cooling the engine. Guess what? They got the basic same concept there, but it takes a lot. Number two, there's indirect water, right? So this is about water consumption from the energy that's got to feed them. That's why these ideas of energy generation, co-location, where are they going to get their energy from? How are we going to actually get it there? It's interrelated with the water resource impacts. And then the third piece is this idea of the indirect water footprint, which is really talking about there are cumulative impacts with data centers. And when we talk about cumulative impacts, it's the idea that it's not just about what they're consuming on a day-to-day, it's about the footprint of that facility and all of its infrastructure and what it's doing to our water resources. Next step, or next slide. Okay, trade-offs. There's two basic approaches that are out there, and again, this is stuff that I'm not making up, it's not me spitballing, this is what's already out there, peer-reviewed, the scientists have done the work, and we know there's two basic approaches, and they have trade-offs. You can do evaporation cooling, or you can do air cooling, and essentially, one's gonna be more effective than the other, and they're both gonna consume a lot of water. Again, I can't stress enough that one of the biggest things that we keep on seeing when we think about this idea of data centers and how they use water is the idea that they have to use it in an immense scale, far more than any other industrial sector of that type. Next section. Okay, want to put a finer point on what Ann already has pointed out, which is we are not talking about what was happening in 2010. We are now talking about what is documented and happening in 2025, 2026, which is the facilities that are being proposed in Montana are hyperscale. They are not your mom and pop that is running a small Bitcoin operation anymore. We are now talking about industrial scale facilities that are 110% about building massive commercial facilities that will consume enormous quantities of water. And when I say enormous, we're talking millions of gallons per day. And one of the biggest issues, of course, becomes, well, where does the water come from? So let's talk about that. Next slide. Where can they acquire water? I had to look outside of my wheelhouse to say, how can I talk about this in a non-lawyer way? Well, this is what I found online, and I'm shamelessly taking. Let's be clear, municipalities own water, and our water rights rules allow people to lease water, so they could potentially try that. They can try to buy it, any property rights in Montana, water is a property right, so you can sell a water right. They can try to do recycling, right? So this idea of the closed loop and a lot of the ideas that we've known about, could they do it at that scale? Debatable, certainly an option. And then there's hybrids, right? So you can try to come up with your own little fiefdom somewhere in the hinterlands that may or may not work. What I want to point out and put a very fine point on is that we are already dealing with an over-allocated system in the vast majority of Montana. What does that mean? It means that right now we live in a closed basin. Many people in Montana, most of our population centers where we have the infrastructure that would support these types of facilities, they already don't have water. And likewise, there are not willing sellers to give that water. This begets a very basic question. If you're coming in with something that's industrial scale, that's going to be these hyperscale facilities, where are they going to get the water from? And that's a big question. Now, obviously, we have some really big rivers in Montana, particularly in the eastern part of the state, where you get a lot of, the flow, the mow, and what have you. But the issue still becomes, you don't have a right to just go and plug a well and start sucking. you got to go through the process. And I think one of the biggest fallacies out there is that they're going to be able to magically gin up the amount of water that you need. And it's not just going to be about the water volume and how they're going to use it. It's also going to be about the other externality. Next slide, which is what else comes with it, right? They're going to have to get rid of the water at some point. And I think one of the biggest points that we've been researching is this idea of that it's a big fallacy to say everything can be magically copacetic because you can do a closed loop system. You're not seeing hyperscale facilities be able to do closed loop systems. They externalize the costs in terms of their water resource effects with pollution and consumption somewhere in the environment. And whether you're hooked into a municipal system, if that's somehow possible, or whether you're out in the hinterlands and you somehow have a water right, there is an enormous volume of waste that's being generated. And one of the biggest questions that we have as an organization that's much focused on, well, how do we make sure that we are, number one, bringing in new industrial scale users so that we can adequately know what they're doing and protect our existing water resources? Well, you need to know what are they discharging. And that's a huge problem. We're talking fundamentally about computer and development of IT that is using a variety of substances, including emerging contaminants and toxins that we don't even know about, and they don't disclose. So I wish I had a sweet slide like Ann showed where it was redacted, but that's what I picture in my mind's eye when we think about what would their discharge permit look like, right? If they went to our environmental regulators and said, hey, we want a discharge permit, what would they actually say is in there? Well, I think that's a really good question, and it's a particularly good question when we think about the geographic destiny of Montana, which is where do they actually get any energy right now, right? Ann's already brought up, it's not just about where the energy, like the volume of energy, it's about where could they actually get that with existing facilities, because we know they want this tomorrow. The second step is where could they get the water, right? Obviously, they're going to want to probably try to co-locate where we have a big water supply, or they get purchase rights or lease water. And then the third question becomes, well, who's living near that? Usually where you have either the existing energy supply or a large enough water supply that might be legally available, guess what? That's where people live. And yet we don't even know what they're going to do with their water. And I want to tell you a quick tale of what's happening in the Yakima Valley and what's happening in Oregon. And what's happened there is you might think, wow, they got a lot of water up there. Well, there are so many data centers at such a scale, and they're pumping the aquifer at such a rate that they're concentrating the existing legacy nitrates that now they're skyrocketing. So drinking water supplies for local communities, yes, you have drinking water, but it's concentrating legacy pollution to such a level that you can't use your drinking water anymore. And this is not a far-fetched idea of what could happen in Montana. Ann just told me tonight that there are already hidden proposals that are suddenly coming to light about what could happen in Jefferson County, that there are proposals right now about a massive hyperscale facility. And what I immediately started thinking about is, where are they going to get their energy? Where are they going to get the water? Headwaters of the Mo. What communities are nearby? What are the prevailing water uses? Senior water rights, ag, rural communities. This is an environmental justice issue. This is a massive material impact on our wildlife, most likely. And we simply don't even know what type of pollutants are being put out into the environment. So again, I would frame big things, keep in mind. Where's the water going to come from, and who's already using it, is entitled to use it? Are they going to be affected? Is our existing regulatory framework up to the task of saying, pay it forward? And number two, what happens when we pollute that water that they're using, and where are they going to put it, right? We shouldn't be answering those questions after the county commission has already rubber stamped an industrial scale facility of 300 acres a mile or two from somebody's drinking water supply, or a mile or two from where a generational rancher is already using that water to dough his wheat field or his bean crop. We need to know what these answers are now. And the reason that this slide is up, and very vague like a good lawyer, right, is that these are rules and frameworks that don't currently, are not adapted today to deal with data centers. And I want to point this out to be very specific. When you think about, hey, somebody's an industrial polluter, you know, our regulators are out there trying to figure out how to make sure that they're not going to have a zero-sum game for the local waterway. We haven't done that at that scale in Montana. We don't have an established general permit. We don't have an established framework for looking at that in Montana. We don't have disclosure of what they use or how they're going to put it or whether there's even adequate treatment. That's what the Clean Water Act and Water Quality Act deals with in Montana. The Safe Drinking Water Act and the UIC program, these are other federal laws that are supposed to protect our aquifers, right? How many of you have probably heard about proposals to put a lot of nasty waste from Calumet up north of Great Falls? They're going to magically inject it into the aquifer just north of the Mo, and it's going to magically assimilate, right? It's just magic. It's fine, don't worry about it. But it's a karst aquifer, which is to say limestone and highly porous. And by the way, USGS has said it's connected to the Mo. So should we be injecting fracking-esque waste into our aquifers? Probably not. These rules are supposed to address that. But let me tell you, right now, our regulators are not on the job with this. And we don't have a framework for looking at the type of wastes that are coming out of these data centers. So I would offer putting wastes and proposing to inject them into our aquifers, which, by the way, a significant portion of Montanans' primary drinking water source is from our shallow aquifers. We probably don't want to double down in putting an unknown belly and volume of toxics into our aquifers. Number 3, let's talk about the Clean Air Act. Yes, I'm a water lawyer primarily, but here's the deal. Air and water are almost one and the same in the end, and it's not just about the toxics that go into the air, it's about the community impacts and the environmental justice issues and the noise, right? There have been studies done ad nauseum since World War II. We know that both noise, VOC, volatile organic compounds, all those that go and get emitted into our airs, they get deposited into your water resources, and it directly affects your health. Again, we do not have an aggressive regulatory framework to make sure that they are paying it forward. We don't have rules saying you can't put this amount out. We don't apply faithfully these new source attainment standards that we've done traditionally for our mercury emitters and what have you. We simply, again, do not have the existing system being forthright and anticipatory to set up for the data centers. Now, you might say, well, don't we have the look before you leap law in Montana? And yes, it still exists, but it's not what it once was. But more to the point, until we have the affirmative burdens and explicit direction from our elected leaders saying we want to know what the impacts are before they're approved, you're going to suffer the consequences and we will be the guinea pigs, right? Because right now, if we don't have a regulatory framework saying these are significant actions, and our elected leaders compelling our agencies to work for us, the people, and ask the questions and disclose the impacts of all the impacts ahead of time, you will be the guinea pigs. Our communities will be the guinea pigs. Our water resources will be the guinea pigs. That is not where we want to be. And then perhaps our most favorite part of all types of rules is our counties. They are, in fact, our local leaders. They are the ones that, in the end, see the widest variety of who knows what, right? They see everything from special use permits all the way to the guy with the chicken farm that came out of nowhere. And they're not equipped to deal with the idea of a data center use. And I want to give you a very real hypothetical in Montana, which is you have the ability in Montana to go out and purchase land. And if it's unzoned, you can legitimately purchase that land. Now, here's the problem. If you're not disclosing ahead of time and we don't have legal requirements to disclose ahead of time what that industrial purpose will be, when and if and only when and if they seek those permits from the county, they're not required to disclose any of the rest of this stuff, right? A special use permit for an industrial use is a special use permit for an industrial use. It doesn't necessarily require disclosure of all the other penumbra of impacts. And we recently saw this with the slaughterhouse that was proposed up in Great Falls, right? The county commissioners issued the special use permit for the largest industrial scale slaughterhouse in the western United States, and yet nobody even knew what the heck they were going to do for the vast problems that were going to come with it. Everything from crime, all the way down to drinking water, all the way to diseases, to the water pollution, right? Like, you just didn't know. And I think this is a very, very real issue for Montanans across, is that we have a rural county framework, and those are the first line of defense, and yet these decision makers are not equipped right now to say yes or no. So to Ann's point, and analogous, right, they have to make decisions based on the record before them. Well, what do we need to do as people, right? Let's go to the next slide. What is my next slide? This is what's needed. That's right. This is where we want to go, people. We want to talk about, okay, we've just heard the parade of horribles. We know that there is a very high likelihood that there are going to be massive ecological, environmental, public health, and pocketbook challenges. So what are we going to do? This is a list of things that are non-exclusive about things that we ought to be doing, and I would argue that we, as a community and as the public, need to be demanding of all of our decision makers at every level. We need to be calling our elected leaders in the legislature, we need to be calling our municipal leadership, and we need to be calling our county leaders. And why do we need to be doing that? We need to be coherent in saying there are very basic things that we can request as a matter of law to establish a framework such that this is a pay-it-forward proposition. This isn't about saying that anyone's a villain. This is 100% about saying we in Montana deserve to know what the consequences of these choices will be and not to simply have to live with them after the choices are already made. And how do you do that? You need to be specific, you need to be coherent, and you need to be overwhelming in saying the same thing. Let's define data centers as a new regulated use. Let's make sure that water consumption has to be adequately regulated through an explicit prerogative, saying you gotta pay it forward. Where's the water gonna come from? No land use approvals until we get that stuff. Let's make sure that we're talking about what the impacts will be. Let's understand the actual hyperscale facility and how it will use water. Let's make sure that a huge part of this, which is the thermal pollution, right? Heating it up. How many of you remember the 1990s with the AOL, ding, 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 you know, and you felt your computer heating up inside the cabinet? I remember that, I was in high school, right? Those computers, imagine that times a couple thousand. The heat is enormous. Where are they gonna put that wastewater that not only contains pollutants, but it's really hot? Well, I don't want it into your drinking water supply. I probably don't want it into our headwater creek with my trout stream, and I probably don't want it where we're gonna recreate with our kids. So let's make sure that we have standards of care in terms of what we're gonna be doing with that wastewater. Let's also make sure that we're prioritizing water supplies, right? Again, Montanans rely heavily on our groundwater and our surface water. It's not just about the big stream or the creek, it's also about protecting that unseen aquifer which supports so much of our quality of life in Montana. We need to make sure that we're not using existing loopholes. You know, this is one of the things as a lawyer that, you know, it's like the worst nightmare, which is a very crafty defense attorney out there is thinking of a new way to use some sort of a loophole that exists that used to be used on a very minor basis, but suddenly it's exploited, and before we know it, you got a bunch of permitted facilities and we're just locked in court for 10 years, and meanwhile someone's well is going dry, their business is dead, and the creek is dead. We don't want to go down that path, so we need to have affirmative investigation, ideally through legislative commands, saying, let's make sure we understand what's on the books and how they're going to be regulated. Let's also make sure, of course, we're protecting our local creeks, streams. This is about the wastewater, this is about the externalizing of those costs. And let's make sure we're disclosing, again, what are we getting into? I can't stress enough that one of the biggest parts of AI and the generative AI and then the tech movement is that the technology is evolving by leaps and bounds. I am not a technologist. I'm just a public interest attorney, but I try to stay up to speed. Thankfully, I have a good computer that's not 6 years old, but at the same time, I do know that these technologies and the creation and use of them create massive outputs, and we need to recognize what they are. We need to have experts tell us what those costs are, and we need to come up with frameworks to protect us from that waste being foisted onto us, our communities, and our waterways. I think lastly, this is perhaps the most important and really should strike home for everyone. In Montana, we have the right to know, and we have the right to participate. We have the strongest daylight laws in the United States. We need to be coherently saying to our decision makers at every level of government, demand transparency. Tell us what's coming in as a proposal to our communities, make sure that the public is being engaged in those decisions, and demand that we understand what the consequences of those choices will be before decisions are being made. And I will leave you with this thought. Again, if we can create tax breaks for an entire new class of an industrial user group, why can we not come up with a framework that demands that they disclose what their impacts will be on our water ahead of time, right? So let's protect our water, let's demand accountability. This is the time to call your elected officials and be consistent and be overwhelmingly clear. We demand transparency. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name's Ashley. Can you hear me in the back okay? Okay, perfect. So I'm a local activist here in Helena, and I'm going to talk about how important it is to collaborate and make connections right now. As I started researching about data centers, where I became really impressed was what was going on in Virginia, which is known as Data Center Alley. Local activists have actually derailed a lot of data centers, blocking them and delaying them, which has been really cool. $64 billion in data center projects have been blocked and delayed because of local opposition to them. And 142 activist groups have been created through this or have started working together. 42 of them in Virginia alone, and they actually started what is known as the Virginia Data Center Reform Coalition. Next slide, please. So because of the coalition, they've been able to organize with environmental groups, conservation groups, homeowners associations, a bunch of different grassroots and formal organizations. Through that, well, not just in Virginia, but across the United States, 23 petitions have been created with more than 31,000 signatures. 12,000 of those came from Virginia because of their activism. This has led to 6 data centers being blocked in Arizona, Missouri, Indiana, 2 in Virginia and Oregon, and 10 being delayed. 7 of those in Virginia, Texas, California, and Indiana. So history of collaboration in Montana. I'm going to get into nuclear power plants for a little bit. Montana has a long history of collaborating.
Can you hold the mic up to your mouth, please?
Yeah, oh yeah, that's louder. Collaborating. So in 1978, a citizens-led initiative passed, which required a public vote for any nuclear facility over 50 megawatts. This has actually stalled any nuclear power plants from being put here in Montana for 45 plus years now. In order to be able to have a nuclear power plant, it requires a majority vote, and it also requires financial or insurance was another part of it. It needs to be fully insured. So yeah, we've been able to stop that. I think we can stop data centers too. So next slide. So why is Montana a target? We are a target because we have cool air. We are a target because we have water, really cool water. We have lots of land that our government is making affordable for them, and our state government has given them an economic incentive of the 0.9% tax rate. Next slide. So this has been my favorite study that I have found that gives a lot of information about data centers. So I really recommend, if you have the opportunity, to go home and look at this study, read through it. So it's what happens when data centers come to town, and it is out of the University of Michigan. Some of the key findings you can see here: increased utility rates, high resource consumption for energy and water, ineffective tax incentives, climate and energy challenges. I'll get into this in a little bit, but that's keeping coal plants open as an example. Resource efficiency trade-offs, and there's policy solutions that they get into. Next slide, please. So subsidies. A lot of subsidies are supposed to go towards creating jobs, but when we see what happens with these data centers, it doesn't actually create a lot of jobs here for Montanans. Both of them got into that a little bit. I have a family that have worked in nuclear power plants. They move around from state to state from each job. So they'll be in Ohio one time, they'll be in New York the next time. They're there for maybe 70, 90 days working on these places, and then they're off to the next one. So it doesn't actually create local jobs. It creates huge surges in utility costs, which they also got into earlier, so I'm not going to talk about that. Keeping the fossil fuel plants open. So they get into the different states that this has occurred in. So Michigan, Virginia, Nebraska, Utah, Georgia, Washington, Indiana are all examples of they were trying to phase out coal plants, and now those coal plants are continuing to still be used and going to stay open to help create energy for these data centers. There's different states doing different things, so policies. In California, they have created this data center tariff. They have also created or have a bill in place that requires reporting for the data centers. Virginia is also trying to do the same thing right now to prohibit those costs from being put onto the local residents. But the one that I found the most interesting, that I really appreciated that this study brought to my attention, is the Germany Energy Efficiency Act. It mandates energy audits, performance standards, renewable energy use, and public reporting. So what they're doing in regards to making sure that there's good policy in place, that was my favorite one that I came across, and I'm glad that this study pointed out. Next slide, please. Okay, so some of the major complaints from communities. I'm from Ohio. This one really struck home to me. In Ohio, 2 Amazon data centers called the fire department 84 times in 1 year. Imagine that happening in Broadview, Montana, where they rely on volunteer firefighters. And when it comes to the chemicals and stuff, this would require hazmat. So hazmat training for firefighters is extremely difficult and takes years to go through. We do not have the ability to handle fires at that scale. Other complaints: low frequency industrial noise, disrupting sleep, shaking their homes, poor air quality. I was just talking to someone the other day that they're starting to do a study and they're finding like rare cancers coming out of people that live close to these data centers, and higher miscarriage rates as well. So there's going to be more information that come out. It's just the beginning of knowing what this is all going to cause. And then this one, so if you look at data centers, they'll say like, oh, we use like 10 million gallons of water on average. But we don't really know that. There's not really any regulations in play to tell us exactly how much is being used. Oregon fought that really, really hard. And so they required one of the data centers in Dales to show how much water they were using. 355 million gallons of water was being used at one data center off of the Columbia River. So we have no idea how much water these data centers are actually going to use. In Montana, we can't handle that, like absolutely cannot handle that. The other thing is, they've talked about this before, the chemicals that are in it, that we aren't exactly sure what all is in the chemical, or what all is in the water that's going to be coming out of these data centers. But some of the ones that they do know is nitrate, glycol, different heavy metals, and PFAS that they use for refrigerants. And they're all coming out much higher levels than the standard groundwater limits. Next slide. This is an article, I also recommend looking into that. She already talked about a New York Times article, but this one's specifically about Georgia and how a lot of well waters ran dry in Georgia when a data center was built next to their home. So more information there and more articles to look at. The effects on the economy, what it's going to do here in Montana. Farmers and ranchers, my best friend is a farmer, they're already running low on water. They are already having to shut off their water partway through the year because of the lack of water. We're going through major droughts year after year. Our farmers should be our priority. Also, fishing. Fishing's one of the biggest economic drivers to Montana. People from all over the US, all over the world come here to enjoy fishing. And so that's one of so with decreased water level, increased water temperature, we're going to have less fish. People aren't going to come here to fish anymore. Our land and clean water are huge economic drivers. These data centers are not going to be economic drivers. No one's going to be coming here for tourism to see these data centers. Initially, data centers, they might employ people to build the bones, but you need specialized people to build the computer systems, the electrical, the plumbing, like what was talked about before. Next slide, please. And then I just did this slide today. I was doing some research on the surveillance of what's going on in the world now, especially what's happening with DHS, ICE, CBP, also what's happening in Gaza with Israel and the mass surveillance that they're doing there. This is just starting to increase. It starts in one place and it's being tested out, and it's going to just keep on going until it reaches us next, which it already has. There's flock systems over at the Lowe's parking lot right now that's taking a picture every time you drive by. And one of the data centers, Atlas, that is going to be put in Butte, that one specializes in surveillance AI. So as these AI centers come, surveillance on us is going to increase as well. So what I recommend you guys do is get involved, get your friends and family involved, use your voice and make a difference. There's multiple organizations that are happy to be a part of this that you can get connected with here tonight. If you're visiting from another part of the state and other parts of the state, that we need to start building collaboration and collective action together. And different ways you can do that. Oh, and I also forgot, if you have your cards, can you go ahead and please pass them down so that way we can start looking through the questions and figuring out what to ask. I meant to ask that earlier, but yeah, just pass them down to the right and that would be great.
He's coming up the aisle, right?
Oh, perfect. Okay. So these are different things that you can do. So they both kind of explain the different government organizations that you can contact. So here's some information and some of the next meetings. So go to the PSC meetings and pressure them. You can give them phone calls, you can send them emails, contact your county commissioner, go to the next county commissioner meeting, put in comments, stop at their office, do whatever you need to do. And then, yeah, contact your state legislators, go to a government energy task force meeting. They have them in person and online through Zoom. And then also, I found this out the other day, attend a land board meeting. Apparently, our land board can rent out state land or lease state land, and that has already been called into question in Butte. So make sure you let your land board know that you do not want state land to be leased to these data centers. And then please, if you didn't have a chance to sign up already, please sign up. The reason why is we'll get your email address and send you some of the information from tonight. So we'll send you links to fact sheets, how to engage, a recording of the event, and the slides from the event tonight.